My wife Sarah was always the perfect one. Perfect grades, perfect job, perfect smile that could charm anyone at our neighborhood barbecues. Everyone loved her, and I was just the quiet husband who somehow got lucky enough to marry way above his league. At least, that's what I believed for 7 years. I'm telling you this story because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the person sleeping next to me every night. By the end, you'll understand why I'm sitting here at 2 a.m., typing this out instead of lying in bed next to her. It started 3 months ago. Sarah had been working late again, which wasn't unusual. She was a marketing director at a tech startup downtown, always hustling for the next big campaign. I respected that about her. She was driven in ways I never was. While she climbed corporate ladders, I was content with my job at the local library, organizing books and helping elderly patrons with their computer questions. That Tuesday night, she came home around 11 p.m., looking absolutely radiant. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, and she seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen in months. She kissed me hello, and I caught a whiff of cologne that definitely wasn't mine. Long day? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Oh, you know how it is, she said, already heading upstairs. Team dinner ran late. We're launching that new campaign next week. I nodded, pushing down the weird feeling in my stomach. Sarah had never lied to me before. She was the honest one in our relationship, sometimes brutally so. When I gained weight during lockdown, she gently suggested we start going to the gym together. When I got passed over for a promotion at work, she gave me the tough love speech about stepping up my game. She was direct, sometimes painfully so, but never dishonest. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Late nights, team dinners, weekend strategy sessions. Sarah was busier than ever, but somehow she seemed happier than ever too. She hummed in the shower, but new clothes, started wearing perfume to work. I told myself I was being paranoid, that her success was just giving her confidence. But then I found the receipt. I was doing laundry, checking pockets before throwing things in the wash, when I pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her blazer. Hotel bar receipt, dated from last Thursday. The same Thursday, she'd told me she was working late at the office. 2 drinks, 2 appetizers, paid for at 9:47 p.m. My hands were shaking as I stared at that piece of paper. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she'd met a client there. Maybe the team had moved their meeting to the hotel bar. Maybe. But deep down, I knew. You know that feeling when everything suddenly clicks into place? When all those little weird moments start making sense. That's what hit me like a freight train standing in our laundry room, holding evidence of my wife's, what? Affair? The word felt too big, too dramatic for quiet, boring me to even think. I didn't confront her. I wish I had, but I didn't. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Sarah would come home from these late meetings and immediately shower. She'd started keeping her phone face down during dinner. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it with this little smile before flipping it back over. She developed new opinions about restaurants I'd never heard of, mentioned movies she'd apparently seen during lunch breaks that lasted 3 hours. The worst part? She was nicer to me than she'd been in years. More affectionate, more attentive. She'd curl up next to me on the couch, play with my hair, ask about my day with genuine interest. It was like she was overcompensating, trying to balance the scales of her guilt with extra kindness. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie there next to her, listening to her breathe, wondering who she was thinking about as she drifted off. Was it him? Did she compare us? Did she wish I was more like whoever he was? 3 weeks after finding the receipt, I decided I needed to know for sure. I took a sick day from work and followed her. I felt like a complete creep, sitting in my Honda Civic outside her office building at 6 p.m., waiting to see if she'd really stay late like she'd texted me. At 6:15, she walked out with a man I'd never seen before. Tall, wearing an expensive suit, the kind of confident stride that suggested he'd never organized a library book in his life. They got into his BMW and drove to Giovanni's, the Italian place downtown that we'd talked about trying for our anniversary but never got around to because it was too expensive. Through the window, I watched them share a bottle of wine, lean across the table toward each other, laugh at private jokes. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 2 hours, watching my wife be more animated and engaged than I'd seen her in months. When they left, they didn't go back to her office. They went to the Marriott. I drove home, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat in the dark waiting for her to come home with another story about team meetings and strategy sessions. She walked in at 11:30, glowing again, and launched into a detailed explanation about how they'd had to work through dinner because of some crisis with the campaign. She was so convincing, so detailed, that for a moment I almost believed her. Almost. "How was your day, honey?" she asked, settling next to me on the couch. "Fine," I managed. "Just fine." For the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize. I checked her phone when she showered. I looked through her car for evidence. I even created a fake social media account to see if I could find him online. His name was Marcus, and he worked at the same company. Recently divorced, owned a boat, posted pictures of expensive vacations and wine tastings. Everything I wasn't. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. Sarah was making coffee, humming that same tune she'd been humming for weeks, when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face lit up. "I need to take this," she said, stepping out onto the patio. I crept close enough to hear her side of the conversation. I know, I miss you too." "No, he's right here. I can't." "Tonight?" I told him I have book club. "Of course I'd rather be with you." Book club. She'd been using book club as her cover story for months. I'd even asked her what they were reading, and she'd made up elaborate discussions about novels I later discovered didn't exist. That's when something inside me snapped. Not into rage, not into dramatics, but into something cold and calculating. I realized I had two choices. I could confront her, have the messy emotional scene, listen to her explanations and apologies and promises to change. Or I could do something else entirely. I chose something else. See, everyone always underestimated me. Quiet librarian, devoted husband, the guy who never made waves. But what they didn't know was that I'd been watching, listening, and learning about people for years. You learn a lot about human nature when you spend your days helping people research their problems, their interests, their secrets. I started documenting everything. Times, dates, locations, photographs. I hired a private investigator, not to catch her in the act, but to build a comprehensive record. I consulted with a divorce attorney, not to file papers, but to understand my options. But most importantly, I started researching Marcus. Turns out, Marcus had some very interesting business dealings. The kind that might interest the IRS. The kind that might also interest his boss, who happened to be Sarah's boss's boss. The kind that might interest his ex-wife, who was apparently still fighting for a fair divorce settlement. I also discovered that Marcus had a pattern. Sarah wasn't his first affair with a coworker. There had been at least 2 others in the past 3 years. He was the kind of man who collected successful women like trophies, enjoyed the thrill of the chase, then moved on when things got complicated. Armed with this information, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Sarah, I decided to let her continue her affair. I became the most supportive husband imaginable. When she said she needed to work late, I encouraged her to take all the time she needed. When she mentioned book club, I asked thoughtful questions about the discussions. When she came home glowing and energized, I told her how proud I was of her success at work. Meanwhile, I was building my case. Not just for divorce, but for something much more satisfying. You see, Sarah had made one crucial mistake. She'd gotten sloppy with her company laptop. She'd been using it to email Marcus, to book hotel rooms, to research weekend getaways. All on company time, using company resources. 3 months into my surveillance operation, I had everything I needed. Comprehensive documentation of her affair, evidence of her misuse of company resources, and detailed information about Marcus's questionable business practices. But I still wasn't ready to pull the trigger. I wanted to understand why. After 7 years of marriage, what had driven her to this? What had I done wrong? What had I failed to provide? So I did something that probably sounds crazy. I started being the husband she deserved. Not the one she'd settled for, but the one she'd actually wanted. I started working out. I updated my wardrobe. I took cooking classes and learned to make the kind of meals she'd been enjoying at her fancy restaurant dates. I planned surprise weekend trips to places she'd mentioned wanting to visit. I became more confident, more assertive, more present. And you know what happened? She started pulling away. The better husband I became, the more distant she grew. The more effort I put into our relationship, the more time she spent with Marcus. It was like she was allergic to the possibility of our marriage actually working. That's when I understood the truth. This wasn't about me not being good enough. This wasn't about Marcus being better than me. This was about Sarah needing the excitement of deception, the thrill of having something forbidden. She didn't want a better husband. She wanted the drama of cheating on the husband she had. That realization was both crushing and liberating. Crushing because it meant our marriage had been built on a foundation I'd never understood. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to fix something that was never actually broken in the way I thought it was. The end came on a Thursday night in November. Sarah had told me she was going to book club, would be home late. I knew she was actually going to Marcus's apartment because I'd seen the texts on her laptop. They were planning to discuss their future together. While she was out, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to human resources at her company. I provided them with detailed documentation of her misuse of company resources, her inappropriate relationship with a coworker, and some interesting information about Marcus's business practices that might warrant further investigation. The second was to Marcus's ex-wife's attorney. I shared some financial documents that might be relevant to their ongoing divorce proceedings. The third was to Sarah's sister, who had always been closer to her than anyone else. I didn't tell her about the affair directly. Instead, I mentioned how worried I was about Sarah's stress levels, how she'd been working such long hours, how I'd noticed she seemed to be struggling with something she couldn't talk about. I suggested maybe she should reach out, see if Sarah needed support. Then I waited. Sarah came home at 1 a.m., which was later than usual. She seemed agitated, stressed in a way I hadn't seen before. She kept checking her phone, frowning at messages. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," she said, but her voice was tight. "Just work stuff." Over the next few days, everything unraveled exactly as I'd predicted. Sarah's company launched an investigation into Marcus's business dealings. His ex-wife's attorney filed new motions in their divorce case. Sarah's sister called, concerned about her well-being, asking direct questions about whether she was happy in her marriage. By Friday, Marcus had been suspended pending investigation. By the following Monday, he'd been terminated. By Wednesday, Sarah had been called in for a disciplinary meeting about her inappropriate use of company resources. I watched all of this unfold from my quiet library desk, checking my email periodically for updates from the private investigator I'd kept on retainer. Sarah was spiraling, but she couldn't figure out why everything was falling apart at once. The beautiful part was that none of it could be traced back to me. I'd been careful, methodical, patient. I'd simply provided various interested parties with information they needed to make informed decisions. I hadn't orchestrated anything. I just facilitated the natural consequences of actions that were already in motion. Sarah's affair with Marcus ended abruptly. Not because they'd been caught, but because he'd cut all contact with her the moment his job became threatened. Turned out, when things got complicated, Marcus was exactly the kind of man who disappeared rather than face consequences. Sarah was left alone, confused, and increasingly paranoid. She'd lost her lover, her job was in jeopardy, and she couldn't understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. She started drinking more, sleeping less, snapping at me over trivial things. 2 weeks after Marcus's termination, she finally broke down and confessed everything. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where she'd taken dozens of secret phone calls, and she told me about the affair. She cried, apologized, begged for forgiveness. She explained how it had started as just friendly conversations, how Marcus had made her feel special, how she'd never meant for it to go as far as it did. I listened quietly, nodding at appropriate moments, asking gentle questions. I held her hand while she cried. I told her I loved her and that we could work through this together. But inside, I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even satisfaction. Just emptiness. The woman I'd been married to for 7 years, the woman I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, was a stranger. Had always been a stranger. We started couples counseling. Sarah threw herself into it with the same intensity she'd brought to her affair. She wanted to understand why she'd made these choices, wanted to rebuild our trust, wanted to become the wife I deserved. But I wasn't interested in rebuilding. I was interested in watching her try to fix something that I'd already decided was unfixable. I went through the motions, said the right things, made the appropriate progress. Meanwhile, I was finalizing my divorce papers. The final revelation came during our 3rd month of counseling. Sarah had been working so hard to be honest, to be transparent, to prove her commitment to our marriage. She'd given me complete access to her phone, her email, her social media. She'd quit her job to remove herself from the environment where she'd made bad choices. She'd cut contact with friends who had enabled her deception. She'd become the perfect wife, just like she'd always been perfect at everything else. That's when I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face all along. Sarah wasn't a cheater who had learned to be faithful. She was a performer who had learned to play a new role. Just like she performed the role of loving wife while conducting her affair, She was now performing the role of repentant wife seeking redemption. The real Sarah was someone who needed to be performing, needed to be managing multiple versions of herself, needed the complexity of deception to feel fully alive. The affair hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness. It had been her authentic self finally expressing itself. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in February. Sarah was at her new job, working at a nonprofit downtown, trying to rebuild her career and her character simultaneously. I left the papers on the kitchen table along with a note explaining that I'd known about the affair for months before she confessed. I didn't tell her about the investigation, the phone calls, or the careful orchestration of consequences. I simply explained that I'd lost the ability to trust her, that counseling had helped me understand we were fundamentally incompatible, and that I wanted us both to be free to find happiness with people who were better suited to our actual needs. When she came home that evening, she found me packing boxes in the spare bedroom. She was devastated, confused, angry. She'd been working so hard to fix our marriage, had made so many sacrifices, had proven her commitment in so many ways. How could I give up on us now? I explained, gently but firmly, that I wasn't giving up. I was accepting reality. The Sarah who had conducted a months-long affair while lying to my face every single day was the real Sarah. The Sarah who was now trying to be the perfect wife was just another performance. I didn't want to be married to either version. I wanted to be free to find someone who didn't need to perform, someone who could be authentic in a relationship. She moved out the following week. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. It was surprisingly amicable, probably because Sarah was still trying to perform the role of the gracious ex-wife who accepted responsibility for the marriage's failure. I kept the house, most of our savings, and my dignity. She kept her secrets, her guilt, and her pattern of needing to be someone different in every relationship. That was 8 months ago. I've been single since then, learning to trust my instincts again, figuring out what I actually want in a partner now that I understand the difference between authentic intimacy and performed affection. I've had a few dates, nothing serious yet, but I'm not in a hurry. I spent 7 years in a relationship with someone who was essentially a stranger. I'd rather be alone than go through that again. The interesting epilogue to this story is that I heard through mutual friends that Sarah is dating again. She's found someone new, someone who thinks she's perfect, someone who has no idea about her capacity for deception. She's probably performing the role of the woman who learned from her mistakes, who values honesty and commitment above all else. And maybe she's even convinced herself that this time it's real, that this time she's being authentic, that this time she won't need the thrill of secrets and lies to feel fully alive. But I know better. I know that somewhere in her new relationship, probably right around the time the excitement of new love starts to fade, she'll start feeling that familiar itch. She'll find herself in conversations that last a little too long, accepting invitations that are a little too personal, making choices that she'll justify as innocent until they're not. Because that's who she is. Not the perfect wife she performed for 7 years, not the repentant wife she performed for 3 months, but the woman who needs the complexity of deception to feel authentic. I don't hate her for it. I don't even judge her for it. Not really. We all have our patterns, our needs, our ways of moving through the world. Hers just happened to be incompatible with the kind of marriage I thought we had. What I learned from this experience is that trust isn't just about believing someone won't lie to you. It's about understanding someone well enough to know when they're being authentic and when they're performing. It's about recognizing the difference between someone who makes mistakes and someone who needs deception to feel alive. I also learned that revenge doesn't have to be dramatic or cruel. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. I didn't destroy Sarah's life. I just stopped protecting her from the results of her actions. The quiet librarian who everyone thought was lucky to have married above his league? He turned out to be more observant, more strategic, and more resilient than anyone expected, including himself. These days, I'm still quiet, still work at the library, still help elderly patrons with their computer questions. But I'm not the same person who used to lie awake wondering what was wrong with him, why he wasn't enough to keep his wife interested in their marriage. I'm someone who understands that being enough has nothing to do with how other people choose to treat you. I'm someone who knows the difference between love and performance. I'm someone who won't settle for being someone else's audience when I could be someone else's authentic partner. And that's worth more than any perfect marriage built on perfect lies. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you understand that sometimes the quiet person in the corner is paying more attention than anyone realizes. Sometimes the person who seems lucky to have what they have is actually strong enough to walk away from it when they discover it isn't real. If you've experienced something similar, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. How did you handle discovering that the person you loved wasn't who you thought they were? What did you learn about yourself in the process? And if you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel for more real stories about the complicated realities of human relationships. Sometimes the most interesting drama is the kind that happens in ordinary living rooms, at ordinary kitchen tables, between ordinary people who turn out to be anything but ordinary.